A magnificent royal ball burned with light inside Blackwood Palace, where chandeliers scattered gold across marble floors and music drifted like a living breath through every corridor. Elena, 7 months pregnant, moved slowly through the palace halls, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly while the other steadied herself against cold stone walls. She was searching for Adrian, her husband, clinging to the fragile hope that tonight might finally soften the distance that had grown between them like an unhealed wound. Lucas and Oliver, her 5-year-old twins, followed closely, their small footsteps echoing softly as they whispered questions about the glittering world around them. They had insisted on seeing their father, believing that tonight might be the night he finally smiled at them the way other fathers smiled at their children. Near the grand ballroom doors, laughter spilled out, sharp, confident, and cruelly unaware of the woman standing just beyond the threshold. Elena stopped. Inside, she saw Adrian surrounded by nobles, his posture relaxed, his voice warm in a way she had not heard directed toward her in months. Beside him stood Lady Vivian Ashcroft, smiling faintly as though she owned the air itself, her presence sharp as perfume and poison. Then Adrian's voice cut through the laughter, casual at first, as if speaking of something insignificant. "I am sick of Elena and her children," he said, and the words fell into the hall like stones into still water. A few nobles laughed softly, mistaking cruelty for wit, while Vivian's smile deepened with quiet satisfaction. Adrian leaned back in his chair, continuing as though confessing an inconvenience rather than a betrayal. "Every day she clings to me," he added, voice colder now, "and I cannot breathe under the weight of it." Elena's breath caught sharply outside the door, her fingers trembling as they pressed instinctively against her unborn child. Lucas tugged her sleeve and asked softly whether Papa was happy when they were not around. Oliver added, almost whispering, that maybe they should try harder to make their father love them. That innocent hope broke something inside Elena that had been holding together for years. She stepped back from the door, suddenly understanding that love was no longer something she could earn. Thunder rolled across the sky outside, as though the world itself answered her silent decision. That night, under a storm that shook the palace walls, Elena moved quietly through the corridors for the last time. She packed only what her hands could carry, her wedding ring resting on top of a folded piece of silk. Lucas and Oliver stood in silence, watching their mother with confused, frightened eyes as rain began to strike the windows harder. Elena knelt before them, brushing their hair back one last time, memorizing every feature as if she feared forgetting love itself. "We are going somewhere safe," she whispered, though her voice trembled like glass under pressure. Behind her, the palace doors loomed like a memory she was forcing herself to abandon. Lucas asked if Papa would come looking for them, and Elena could not answer without breaking. Oliver simply held her hand tighter, as if refusing to let the world take any more from them. The carriage wheels began to turn through the storm, carrying them away from everything she had once called home. As lightning split the sky, Elena finally looked back once, and saw Blackwood Palace glowing like a distant dream she could never return to. Inside that light, she could still hear Adrian's voice repeating itself like poison wrapped in elegance. And as the storm swallowed the road behind them, her youngest son asked one last question that changed everything. "Mama, where does a broken family go when it has nowhere left to belong?" Elena did not answer immediately because the truth was something no child should ever have to understand so young. She pulled both boys closer under her arms, feeling their small bodies tremble against the storm outside and the storm inside her chest. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice breaking into something softer than pain and heavier than grief. The carriage rocked violently as thunder cracked overhead, and the driver urged the horses faster through the endless rain-soaked road. Inside, Lucas wiped his eyes, trying not to cry, while Oliver stared at the fading silhouette of the palace they were leaving behind. Elena watched them both, realizing that every breath she took now had to be strong enough for 3 lives instead of 1. The storm outside began to calm, but within Elena something had hardened into a quiet resolve that would not break again. Far behind them, Blackwood Palace disappeared into darkness, leaving behind a life she no longer recognized as her own. Lucas whispered that maybe someday Papa would understand, and Elena closed her eyes, unsure whether hope was a kindness or a curse. Oliver leaned against her shoulder and asked if they would ever be warm again. Elena kissed his forehead, not answering, because the future had already begun writing itself in silence. As the carriage vanished into the storm-soaked horizon, she held her children tighter than she had ever held anything in her life. And somewhere deep within the palace, unaware of what had been lost, Duke Adrian Blackwood raised his glass and laughed once more. He spoke of loyalty and ambition, believing control was the same as love, while the woman he had broken disappeared into the night with his future quietly unraveling behind her. The storm finally passed, leaving only echoes of thunder across the empty road as the carriage carried Elena toward an unknown beginning she could no longer afford to fear. At the edge of dawn, Elena looked back one final time, seeing only fading darkness where Blackwood Palace once ruled her life, while Lucas asked softly if this was truly the end, and she realized that beginnings often arrive disguised as endings. No one is ready to survive alone. Yet in the dark still Elena reached the coastal town under a sky the color of old ash, where the wind carried salt instead of music and every street seemed to forget warmth. The carriage that had brought her from the palace vanished without ceremony, leaving only the echo of wheels and the trembling silence of her children beside her. Lucas held her coat tightly, as if fabric alone could protect them from the world. Oliver stared at the unfamiliar buildings, asking why no one bowed anymore. Elena had no answer that would not wound them further. They found shelter in a narrow room above a baker's shop, where the ceiling leaked during rain and the walls carried the scent of burned bread. Elena sold the last of her jewelry within days, watching gold dissolve into coins that barely kept them fed. Each piece felt like a memory leaving her hands for the final time. Still, she smiled for her children, teaching them to share bread and laugh softly so the neighbors would not hear hunger. Weeks became months. Winter arrived early, pressing frost against the windows like an unwelcome guest. Elena worked wherever she was allowed, washing linen, mending clothes, carrying water, her body heavy with pregnancy, her pride buried beneath necessity. Lucas began to help her without being asked, carrying buckets almost too heavy for him. Oliver learned to comfort his mother when pain bent her spine, placing small hands on her back as though he could hold her together. One afternoon, a woman arrived at their door wrapped in a plain shawl, her face lined with quiet age and careful kindness. She introduced herself as Margaret, a traveler with no home worth mentioning. Yet her eyes lingered on Elena with unsettling attention, as though recognizing something hidden beneath hardship. Margaret began visiting often, bringing small portions of food or simply sitting beside the children as they played. She never asked for repayment, only stories. Elena, worn down by silence, eventually told her everything. The palace, the words, the storm, and the night she left behind her name. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Elena finished, she expected judgment or pity. Instead, Margaret whispered that some betrayals do not destroy worth, only reveal it. The words unsettled Elena more than cruelty ever had. As winter tightened its grip, Elena's labor began during a storm that shook the town. Snow fell sideways and the sea roared like something alive beyond the cliffs. The villagers gathered quickly, offering warmth, blankets, and trembling encouragement. Lucas stood outside the room, refusing to leave, while Oliver clung to his brother's sleeve, both of them pale with fear. Elena's cries were swallowed by wind as she fought through hours that felt like lifetimes, breaking apart and reforming inside her body. Inside the small room, Margaret stayed beside her, holding her hand with surprising strength. When the final moment came, silence fell so sharply it felt like the world had paused to listen. Then a cry rose, fragile but unmistakably alive. A daughter. The midwife placed the child into Elena's arms, and for a moment the pain vanished beneath overwhelming relief. She named her Rose, because even in winter something gentle had finally survived. Lucas entered first, his eyes wide as he approached the baby with cautious wonder. Oliver followed, hesitant, then smiled as he touched his sister's tiny fingers. "She looks like morning," Lucas said quietly, as if afraid the words might break the moment. Elena wept without sound, holding all three of her children as though the world had finally given her something it once stole. Margaret watched from the doorway, her hands folded, her gaze distant. That night, as Elena slept briefly between exhaustion and relief, Margaret stepped outside into the storm and signaled to a waiting rider. "Send word to the capital," she said softly. "Tell them I have found her." The rider bowed and disappeared into the white darkness, while Margaret looked back at the small window glowing faintly above the bakery. Inside, Elena held her newborn daughter, unaware that the world she escaped had just begun to look for her again. In the days that followed, Elena began to notice how silence itself could change shape. The town no longer felt entirely unknown. It watched her now with cautious familiarity, as if even hardship eventually becomes recognized. She rose before dawn each morning, cradling Rose while Lucas and Oliver slept curled together like two small survivors refusing to be separated by fear. Margaret continued to visit, though her presence grew quieter, her eyes often distant as if carrying a burden older than the storm outside. Once, she touched Rose's cheek and lingered too long, her expression tightening with something like grief disguised as restraint. Elena tried not to question it. She had learned that questions often open doors better left closed. Still, sometimes she caught Margaret standing at the window, staring toward the road that led back to the capital, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her shawl. On one such evening, a distant horn echoed faintly through the wind, and Margaret went still, her breath catching as though she had been waiting for that sound longer than Elena could imagine. Inside the room, Lucas asked if people ever truly disappeared, and Oliver wondered if memories could be buried like seeds and still grow again. Elena held them close, unsure how to answer without revealing how fragile safety truly was. Outside, the storm finally began to break, but far beyond the horizon, something far more dangerous than weather was already moving toward them. That night, Margaret finally made a choice she had delayed for years, writing a second urgent message sealed with royal wax, her hands trembling as she watched the candle burn low. Far away, riders were already crossing frozen roads toward the coast, carrying orders that could change everything Elena had just begun to rebuild. Snow began to fall again as if the world itself refused to let the past stay buried. Outside the small coastal home, Elena had begun to believe that survival was the only inheritance left to her, until the night Margaret finally stopped pretending to be a simple traveler. That evening, the wind outside carried a strange stillness, as if the world itself had paused to witness what was about to be revealed. Margaret arrived without her usual softness, her posture straightened, her eyes no longer belonging to a wandering woman but to someone accustomed to command. Lucas and Oliver sensed the change immediately, stepping closer to Elena as though instinct warned them that safety itself had begun to shift. Margaret knelt before Elena, and for the first time her voice carried the weight of truth she had buried beneath years of secrecy. "I am not who I claim to be," she said, and the words fell like iron into the quiet room. Elena felt her breath tighten, her hands instinctively moving toward her children as if distance alone could protect them from uncertainty. The woman who had shared their bread in silence now lifted her gaze and spoke a name that no one in that room had ever been allowed to address so casually. "I am Isabella, queen of this realm," she said, and the air itself seemed to bend beneath the truth of it. Elena stepped back in disbelief, the name striking deeper than pain, because queens did not wander into poverty without reason. Margaret explained that Elena's mother had once saved Isabella during a rebellion, pulling her from death when no one else dared move. That single act of courage had bound their families together in a promise that outlived both war and time itself. The queen's eyes softened as she admitted she had watched Elena suffering from afar, unable to intervene without exposing the truth too early. Instead, she had waited, trusting that Elena's strength would survive what kindness could not immediately fix. Meanwhile, far beyond the coast, Blackwood Palace was beginning to rot beneath the weight of its own deception. Adrian sat alone in chambers that once echoed with confidence, now filled only with the silence of consequence. Lady Vivian moved through the palace like a shadow wearing silk, draining his wealth while whispering reassurances that had always been lies. He finally discovered forged letters that painted Elena as disloyal, each one carefully crafted to destroy his trust in her. The realization struck him not like anger but like collapse, as everything he believed about control and love dissolved at once. In the silence that followed, he whispered Elena's name as though speaking it might somehow bring back the life he had ruined. That same night, riders crossed frozen roads toward the coast carrying sealed orders stamped with the Queen's authority. The message was simple, but its implications were vast enough to redraw the balance of power across the entire kingdom. In the capital, rumors began to spread before the truth arrived, twisting itself through noble houses like smoke through broken windows. Vivian smiled through it all, unaware that the foundation beneath her carefully built influence was already collapsing in silence. Elena, still unaware of the approaching storm, watched her children sleep and felt for the first time that peace might be possible. Lucas murmured in his sleep, calling out for warmth that no palace had ever given him. Oliver clutched his blanket tighter, whispering a name that sounded like memory rather than comfort. Margaret stood alone outside the cottage, watching the sea darken as if it carried secrets even older than crowns. She knew that once the Queen's summons reached Elena fully, there would be no returning to anonymity again. The rider pressed forward through snow and wind, driven by duty that allowed no hesitation or mercy. Far ahead, the coast waited in fragile silence, unaware that history was about to find it once more. Inside the cottage, Elena finally allowed herself a moment of stillness, unaware that stillness often precedes irreversible change. She watched Rose sleep, tracing the delicate rise and fall of her breath as if memorizing proof that hope still existed. Lucas sat nearby reading a worn book he had found, pretending not to notice the worry in his mother's eyes. Oliver drew small pictures in the dirt floor, sketching homes that did not yet belong to anyone they knew. Margaret returned before dawn, her face pale, her silence heavier than the storm that had passed the night before. She placed a sealed letter on the table, her hands trembling slightly as though it burned even before being opened. "It is time," Margaret said softly, though her voice carried the weight of something far greater than personal choice. Elena looked at the letter but did not touch it immediately, as though delay could protect what truth would destroy. Outside, the sound of horses echoed faintly, growing closer with each passing breath of wind. Lucas paused, listening, his young face tightening as if he already understood that peace was being taken away again. Oliver stood quickly, moving toward Elena as uncertainty filled the room like smoke without fire. Margaret stepped closer to the window, watching the approaching riders with a resignation that suggested she had expected them all along. Elena finally reached for the letter, her fingers trembling as though touching it might split her life into before and after. The seal bore the unmistakable mark of the royal court, a symbol she had never expected to see again so soon. Margaret exhaled slowly and spoke the truth that would shatter whatever fragile normality still remained in Elena's world. "You are not only the daughter of a noble house," she said, "you are the sole heir to everything your grandfather built." Elena froze, the words echoing inside her like thunder trapped beneath skin, impossible to escape or ignore. Lucas reached for her hand, sensing fear without understanding its shape. Oliver whispered her name, uncertain whether he should be afraid of the woman delivering such impossible news. Outside, the riders finally reached the edge of the town, their horses cutting through snow as royal insignia flashed beneath the dim light, while inside Elena stared at the sealed letter, realizing that every hardship she had endured was only the beginning of a far larger destiny she had been kept from knowing, and Margaret whispered that the Queen herself awaited her return to the capital because the kingdom could no longer afford her absence. Even as far away in Blackwood Palace, Adrian raised his head as if sensing the ground shift beneath everything he had built, and for the first time fear entered his expression. 5 years passed like a river that refused to return what it had taken, carving Elena into someone the kingdom no longer recognized as the broken Duchess who once vanished into a storm. Her name no longer lived in whispers of pity but in headlines carved across cities, spoken with reverence and disbelief. The woman who once walked barefoot through poverty now stood at the center of rebuilding efforts that reshaped entire provinces. Schools rose where abandoned land once rotted, hospitals replaced silence, and trade routes flourished under her guidance with quiet precision. People began calling her the Duchess of Light, though she never asked for such a name. Lucas and Oliver had grown beneath her protection like strong roots in fertile soil that had once known drought. Lucas, now 10, carried a calm intelligence that softened every room he entered, while Oliver's sharper energy gave him a fearless honesty that unsettled those who preferred comfort over truth. Rose, still young, moved through their world like morning itself, untouched by memory of suffering yet born from its survival. Elena watched them often, aware that every success they carried had been built from loss she would never fully forget. Far away, Blackwood Palace had decayed in subtler ways. Duke Adrian Blackwood no longer ruled with certainty. His wealth had bled away under Lady Vivian Ashcroft's manipulations. Each contract she guided him into tightening like invisible chains. Allies who once praised him now avoided his gaze, and court gatherings where his voice once commanded attention now passed over him like wind over stone. Vivian, still beautiful in the way venom can appear elegant, remained beside him, though her affection had long since transformed into calculation. The kingdom prepared for a royal celebration marking unity between provinces, an event designed to display stability after years of unrest. It was there, within the restored capital palace, that Elena was expected to return for the first time since her disappearance. Rumors preceded her arrival like thunder before rain. Some claimed she had died. Others insisted she had been ruined beyond recognition. None were prepared for what stepped through the palace gates that evening. Elena arrived not in secrecy but in presence. Her carriage bore no arrogance, only certainty. When she stepped onto the marble steps of the palace, silence followed her like a respectful shadow. She wore deep sapphire silk that caught the light in quiet waves, and her posture carried the kind of stillness that no longer needed validation. Lucas walked beside her with composed awareness, while Oliver scanned the crowd with instinctive alertness. Rose clutched her hand, smiling at everything as though the world had never known cruelty. Inside the grand hall, nobles gathered beneath crystal chandeliers that fractured light into trembling fragments. Music faltered as whispers spread faster than sound could recover. Adrian stood among them, older now, marked by years that had stripped him of certainty but not yet of memory. When his eyes found Elena, time itself seemed to hesitate. He did not recognize the absence of fear in her anymore. He only recognized what he had lost. Vivian noticed first, her smile tightening as recognition turned into calculation. She stepped slightly forward, expecting control to remain hers, but the room had already shifted. Elena moved through the hall without hesitation, acknowledging neither hostility nor admiration. Every step she took rewrote the space around her, forcing even those who once dismissed her to reconsider what they believed they knew. The Queen arrived shortly after, her presence commanding immediate silence. Queen Isabella descended the central staircase with deliberate grace, her gaze fixed not on ceremony but on truth. Beside her walked Prince Alexander, whose reputation for justice and restraint had made him a respected figure within the court. His attention shifted immediately toward Elena, not with curiosity but recognition of significance. Isabella raised her voice, and the hall settled into absolute stillness. She spoke of restoration, of hidden legacies, and of debts the kingdom had forgotten. Then she turned toward Elena and revealed what many had only suspected in fragments. The vast estates and merchant fleets once thought lost belonged to her alone, inherited through bloodlines buried beneath political silence. Gasps spread through the court like cracks forming in glass. Vivian's composure fractured. She attempted to speak, but her words dissolved beneath the weight of exposure. Documents were presented, alliances revealed, and financial manipulations laid bare before every witness. Adrian stood motionless as truth unfolded around him, realizing that every downfall he had endured was tied directly to deception he had allowed to flourish within his own home. Elena did not look at him at first. She addressed the court instead, her voice steady and measured, carrying neither vengeance nor weakness. She spoke of rebuilding, of responsibility, and of power that existed only when used for others rather than against them. The hall listened as if discovering a language they had forgotten how to understand. Then finally her gaze met Adrian's. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with years that could not be reclaimed. Adrian stepped forward, but no one moved with him. Even Vivian remained frozen, stripped of influence and certainty. He opened his mouth, but no apology emerged, only recognition of irreversible loss. Elena turned away, not in anger but in completion. That movement alone struck harder than any condemnation. Prince Alexander observed quietly, noting not weakness in her restraint but strength in its discipline. The Queen watched as well, understanding that forgiveness was no longer the question shaping this moment. Transformation was. As the evening continued, whispers shifted from scandal to reverence. Elena's presence redefined the celebration itself, turning it from spectacle into reckoning. Lucas stood slightly behind her now, observing how adults who once held power struggled to stand in her shadow. Oliver noticed Adrian's expression, quietly asking Elena whether people always looked like that when they lost something important. Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the hall settle into uneasy respect, aware that this moment marked neither victory nor closure, but the beginning of something far more unstable. Outside the palace windows, night deepened over the capital, and far beyond its walls, movements had already begun that even the Queen could not yet fully see. Prince Alexander lingered near Elena as the hall slowly resumed motion, though nothing within it had returned to ease. His expression remained composed, yet something in his gaze followed her with careful attention, as though measuring the weight of her presence against the future of the kingdom. Elena noticed but did not respond, her focus remaining steady on the shifting court. Behind them, Adrian stood unmoving, the realization of irreversible loss settling into him like cold iron. Vivian retreated into the crowd, her influence dissolving with every passing whisper, until she was no longer feared but merely observed. The Queen descended the final step and spoke quietly to Elena, warning that power newly revealed always attracts unseen danger. Elena nodded once, understanding without needing elaboration. Outside the palace, distant riders paused at the edge of the capital, watching the lights as if waiting for permission to enter before the night finally held its breath again. The night after the royal gathering did not bring peace to the capital. It brought awareness, as if the entire kingdom had finally opened its eyes to a truth it had long avoided. Elena returned to the estate prepared for her not as a guest but as its rightful steward, yet she did not feel ownership in the way others expected. Lucas walked beside her quietly, already sensing that the world had shifted again, while Oliver asked whether powerful people always became silent after hearing the truth. Rose slept in her arms, unaware that her name alone now carried the weight of inheritance and history. Behind them, Prince Alexander observed in measured silence, noting how Elena neither celebrated nor collapsed under the revelation, but simply continued forward as though responsibility had always been her language. Adrian did not approach her that night. He stood at a distance in the palace corridors, watching her pass like a figure belonging to a life he could no longer enter directly. For the first time, there was no anger in his expression, only a hollow recognition that pride had cost him something irreplaceable. Vivian was gone from the public halls, escorted away under royal decree, her influence dismantled without spectacle. The Queen made no announcement of mercy or punishment. The consequences spoke for themselves. Elena did not turn back, yet she felt the weight of being watched by someone who once believed she would always return. Days passed, then weeks, and the court slowly adjusted to the new balance of power. Elena resumed her work, not as revenge against the past, but as continuation of what she had already begun in exile. Schools received funding, hospitals expanded, and trade routes stabilized under her guidance. Lucas began accompanying advisors, learning the language of governance with quiet focus. Oliver found comfort in observing the lives of ordinary people in the city, asking questions that revealed a sharp understanding of fairness. Rose grew surrounded by safety she did not yet know she had once been denied. Adrian's presence, however, remained a constant silence at the edge of her world. He did not demand forgiveness, nor did he attempt to reclaim authority. Instead, he began appearing where he was least expected, at orphan shelters, rebuilding efforts, and labor stations, not as Duke but as a man stripped of certainty. He worked without announcement, carrying materials, repairing structures, and listening more than speaking. People noticed the change slowly, but Elena did not acknowledge it directly. She understood that transformation, if real, did not require observation to exist. One evening, during a winter wind that moved through the capital like memory itself, Lucas asked Elena why some people tried to become better only after losing everything. She did not answer immediately, because some truths required distance from pain before they could be spoken. Oliver added that he thought Papa looked like someone trying not to disappear. Elena finally replied that sometimes people spend their entire lives learning what they should have understood at the beginning. None of them spoke Adrian's name, yet he was present in every pause. Prince Alexander visited Elena that night to deliver correspondence from the Queen. Their conversation remained respectful and restrained, but beneath it lay a recognition that the kingdom's stability now rested significantly on Elena's decisions. He did not disguise his admiration, yet he also did not impose expectation upon her. Instead, he offered support without condition, something Elena had rarely received from those tied to power. When he left, he paused briefly, glancing toward the gardens where Adrian stood alone in the cold distance, then continued without comment. Months continued to pass. Adrian's efforts did not erase the past, but they reshaped perception. He never asked to return to his former position. He simply remained where consequences placed him, rebuilding what could be repaired without seeking reward. Elena observed this not with softness but with clarity. She had no illusion that suffering alone created redemption, yet she also recognized the sincerity in actions repeated without witness. The turning point came not with declaration, but with silence broken at last. One evening in the palace gardens, where cherry blossoms had begun to return despite the season's reluctance, Elena stood with her children. Lucas and Oliver played nearby, their laughter echoing softly between stone paths, while Rose chased petals drifting through the air. Adrian approached slowly, stopping at a distance that respected the boundary she had never verbally defined. For a moment no one spoke. He did not ask for forgiveness immediately. Instead, he looked at the children, then at Elena, and acknowledged without defense what he had destroyed. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, stripped of authority and certainty. He said he did not expect return, only truth. Elena listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, as if weighing not emotion but consequence. When he finished, silence returned, heavier than before. Lucas looked at Elena, uncertain whether to speak. Oliver held Rose's hand instinctively, as if sensing tension without understanding it fully. The wind moved through the blossoms, scattering petals across the ground like fragments of time. Elena finally stepped forward, not toward Adrian but toward her children, adjusting Rose's shawl gently. She said that some wounds do not disappear, but they can stop bleeding when no longer reopened. Adrian lowered his gaze, absorbing words that did not absolve but did not destroy either. Days later, Elena allowed Adrian to walk with them during public visits to the city. He never assumed place beside her, only presence at a respectful distance that slowly became familiar rather than painful. The people observed this transformation quietly, noting that authority rebuilt through humility carried different weight than authority enforced by fear. Lucas began speaking to him more freely, Oliver asked questions without hesitation, and Rose reached for his hand without memory of betrayal. Years later, the kingdom no longer spoke of scandal when speaking of Blackwood. It spoke of restoration, of rebuilding, and of a woman who transformed loss into structure. On a spring evening beneath flowering trees, Elena stood beside Adrian without tension between them, not as a restoration of what once was, but as recognition of what had become. Lucas and Oliver ran ahead through the garden paths, while Rose laughed as she chased light through petals falling like quiet forgiveness. Adrian did not reach for Elena immediately, but when she finally extended her hand, it was not out of surrender nor obligation, but understanding earned through time and change that neither of them had taken for granted anymore, and as the sun lowered beyond the palace walls, the kingdom that once broke them now bore witness to a family no longer defined by its fracture but by its choice to remain present within what had survived and what had been rebuilt together. Under the fading light of evening, Elena understood that healing was never perfection but endurance shaped into grace, and Adrian finally understood that love demanded responsibility long after regret arrived, while the children ran forward into tomorrow carrying neither the weight of the past nor fear of the future, only the quiet certainty of belonging at last together in peace now.